The wind that night did not merely blow, it shrieked like a wounded animal, tearing through the valley of Silver Creek with a ferocity that froze the marrow in a man's bones. It was a whiteout, a blizzard of biblical proportions, yet inside the dilapidated homestead of Barnaby Thorne, the atmosphere was even colder than the storm raging outside. The door flew open, caught by a violent gust, but it was not the wind that pushed the young woman out into the abyss. It was a pair of cruel, calloused hands. Leanne, 25 years old and possessing a delicate beauty that seemed entirely out of place in this harsh frontier, stumbled backward into the drifts. Her gray prairie dress, already tattered from months of thankless labor and neglect, offered no protection against the biting frost. She fell hard, the snow instantly soaking through the thin fabric, biting at her skin like 1,000 needles. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the dying light of the hearth he denied her, stood Barnaby. He was a man consumed by the bottle and a deep, festering bitterness, his face twisted in a sneer that held no trace of humanity. He had expected a servant, a silent worker to make his failing farm profitable, but he had found his Chinese bride too quiet, too foreign, and ultimately, in his drunken logic, a burden he no longer wished to carry. "Don't come back till you freeze or find your way back to where you came from," he roared over the howling wind, his voice slurred and heavy with malice. He slammed the heavy oak door shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot, sealing her fate. Leanne scrambled to her knees, pounding on the wood, her fingers already turning numb. "Please," she cried out, though the wind snatched her words away before they could reach him. "It is death out here. Please!" There was no answer, only the sliding of the heavy iron bolt on the other side. She was alone. The darkness of the Montana Territory swallowed her whole, the temperature dropping rapidly as the true heart of the storm settled over the valley. She curled into herself, the gray dress fluttering uselessly, a fragile flower cast onto a sheet of ice. As her vision began to blur and the cold replaced the fear with a terrifying, drowsy numbness, she wondered if this was how her story ended, forgotten, buried under 6 feet of snow, far from the land of her ancestors. Before we witness the miracle that awaits in the snow and see how fate has a way of balancing the scales of justice, I want to know where you all are tuning in from today. Are you watching from a warm city apartment, or perhaps a quiet house in the country? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this story if you believe that every act of cruelty eventually meets its match. Now, let us return to the frozen expanse of Silver Creek, where a life hangs by a thread. Miles away from the Thorne homestead, the world was a canvas of unblemished white, save for the solitary figure cutting a path through the deep drifts. Gideon Mercer sat atop his massive brown stallion, a beast as rugged and stoic as its master. Gideon was a man of few words and fewer friends, a rancher who preferred the company of his cattle and the whispering pines to the gossip of the town council. He had been out checking the northern fence line, worried that the blizzard might have driven his herd into the treacherous ravines, but the storm had worsened faster than he anticipated. The snow was falling so thick it was nearly blinding, sticking to his heavy woolen coat and the brim of his hat, turning him into a ghost riding through the mist. His horse, a loyal creature named Rusty, snorted and tossed his head, fighting the gale. Gideon patted the beast's neck with a gloved hand, murmuring a low reassurance. "Easy, boy. We're heading home. Just a few more miles." He squinted against the stinging ice crystals, his eyes scanning the horizon out of habit more than hope. It was then that he saw it. A shape that didn't belong. It wasn't a rock, nor a fallen log. It was a mound of gray, almost buried, contrasting faintly against the pure white snow. Most men would have ridden past, assuming it was a trick of the light, or perhaps a dead calf. But Gideon felt a pull in his gut, an instinct honed by years of surviving in the wild. He steered Rusty toward the shape, the horse protesting the detour through the deeper powder. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something that made Gideon's heart hammer against his ribs. It was the hem of a dress. He swung down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, his boots sinking deep into the snow as he waded toward the figure. He fell to his knees, brushing the snow away frantically. When he uncovered her face, he gasped. It was a woman, her skin as pale as the ice beneath her, her raven hair matted with frost. She was curled in a fetal position, her gray dress stiff and frozen. "Miss?" he barked, pulling off his glove to press a warm hand against her neck. Her skin was marble cold, but there, faint, fluttering like a dying bird, was a pulse. She was alive, but only just. A surge of protective fury welled up in him. Who would leave a woman out here? He didn't waste time with questions. He scooped her up, her body alarmingly light, a fragile weight against his chest. She didn't stir. He struggled back to the horse, lifting her up before mounting behind her, wrapping his heavy coat around her small frame, trying to share whatever body heat he had left. "Hold on," he whispered into the howling wind, spurring Rusty into a gallop. "I've got you. You're safe now." The journey back to Gideon's cabin was a blur of adrenaline and fear, the rancher constantly checking the woman in his arms to ensure the fragile spark of life hadn't been extinguished by the relentless cold. When the dark outline of his cabin finally appeared through the swirling snow, it looked like a sanctuary sent from the heavens. He didn't bother with the stable yet. He rode right up to the porch, sliding off with Leanne still clutched tight to his chest. He kicked the door open, staggering into the warmth of the main room. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, but the room still held a residual heat that felt like a physical blow after the freezing outdoors. He laid her gently on the rug before the fireplace, immediately moving to stoke the fire. He threw logs onto the embers, blowing on them until the flames roared back to life, casting dancing shadows across the log walls. He turned back to her, his brow furrowed with concern. She was shivering now, violent, racking tremors that shook her entire body. It was a good sign. It meant her body was fighting, but she was still dangerously cold. He knew he had to get the frozen, wet clothes off her, but he hesitated, a man of honor caught in a desperate situation. "Forgive me, miss," he muttered to the silent room, his voice rough. "I have to get you warm." With clumsy, trembling fingers, he began to undo the buttons of the tattered gray dress. The fabric was stiff with ice, tearing easily. He worked with the utmost respect, averting his eyes as much as possible, stripping away the soaked layers until she was left in her undergarments. He grabbed the thick quilt from his own bed, a heavy patchwork of wool and flannel, and wrapped her tightly in it, creating a cocoon of warmth. He lifted her again, settling her onto the chaise near the fire, propping her head up with a pillow. He then set about boiling water, his movements efficient and practiced. He found his tin of medicinal salve, preparing to treat the frost nip he had seen on her fingers and nose. As the kettle began to whistle, Gideon sat back on his heels, watching her face. She was beautiful, even in this state, with high cheekbones and delicate features that spoke of a grace the rough frontier rarely saw. He wondered what her name was. He wondered who she was. But mostly, he wondered what kind of monster could throw her away like garbage. The anger simmered in his gut, hot and heavy, a stark contrast to the tender way he brushed a stray lock of wet hair from her forehead. He would find out who did this, and when he did, there would be a reckoning. Hours passed, marked only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the crackling of the fire. The storm outside continued to rage, sealing them into a world of their own. Gideon had not moved from her side, only rising to add more wood to the fire or to check the broth he was simmering on the stove. He had managed to dribble a little warm water between her lips, and the color was slowly returning to her face, the deathly pallor replaced by a faint flush. Suddenly she gasped. It was a sharp, terrified sound, and her eyes flew open. They were dark, deep pools of panic. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the back of the chaise, pulling the quilt up as a shield. Her eyes darted around the room, the trophies on the wall, the heavy timber beams, and finally the large bearded man sitting on the floor near her. "No, no," she whispered, her voice a cracked rasp. She held up her hands as if to ward off a blow, flinching when Gideon shifted his weight. She was expecting pain. She was expecting anger. "Easy," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a low, soothing rumble like distant thunder. He raised his hands, palms open, showing he held no weapon, no malice. "You're safe. You're at the Double Creek Ranch. My name is Gideon." He didn't move closer, giving her the space she desperately needed. Leanne stared at him, her chest heaving. This was not the man who had thrown her out. This man was larger, broader, with eyes that were not red with drink, but clear and gray, like the winter sky. But fear was a habit hard to break. "Barnaby?" she asked, the name trembling on her lips. Gideon's jaw tightened at the name, recognizing it instantly. Barnaby Thorne, the drunkard down in the valley. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with a sickening clarity. "He isn't here," Gideon said firmly, a steely edge entering his voice before he softened it again for her sake. "You are miles away from him. I found you in the snow. Do you remember?" Leanne blinked, the memories crashing back into her mind. The open door, the screaming wind, the cold that felt like fire. She looked down at the quilt, then at her hands. They were covered in a thick, herbal-smelling salve. She looked back at Gideon, really seeing him for the first time. He wasn't looking at her with lust or ownership. He was looking at her with a profound, sorrowful concern. You saved me?" she whispered, the English words feeling heavy on her tongue. "I reckon I did," Gideon nodded slowly. "Or maybe the horse did. He saw you first." The silence that stretched between them was not uncomfortable, but heavy with unasked questions. Gideon rose slowly, moving with a deliberate slowness so as not to startle her, and went to the stove. He ladled soup into a tin cup, the steam rising in curling ribbons. He walked back and held it out to her. "Drink. It's beef broth. It'll help the shivering." Leanne hesitated, her hands shaking as she reached out to take the cup. Her fingers brushed his, hers small and delicate, his large and calloused, and she felt a jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She took a sip, the hot liquid burning its way down her throat, spreading life through her frozen limbs. She lowered the cup, clutching it with both hands. "I am Leanne," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the fire. I am wife to Barnaby Thorne." Gideon sat back down on his stool, his face unreadable, though his eyes burned. "Wife," he repeated, the word tasting like bile. "A man treats his cattle better than he treated you, Leanne." She looked down, shame coloring her cheeks. "I was not what he wanted," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "He wanted a strong woman, someone to pull the plow when the mule died, someone to be loud." She gave a sad, bitter smile. "I tried. I cooked. I cleaned. But the snow came, and the whiskey ran out, and he said—" Her voice broke, and she squeezed her eyes shut. "He said I was just another mouth to feed." Gideon listened, his fists clenching at his sides until the knuckles turned white. He knew the isolation of the frontier drove men mad, but this was not madness. This was evil. He looked at Leanne, broken, discarded, yet possessing a quiet dignity that filled the room. He realized then that the storm had brought him something far more valuable than any herd of cattle. "You aren't a mouth to feed, Leanne," Gideon said, his voice fierce and absolute, compelling her to look at him. "You're a human being, and as long as you are under my roof, you will never be hungry, and you will never be cold again." It was a promise, and Gideon Mercer was a man who kept his promises. Leanne looked into his eyes, and for the first time in months, the icy grip of fear around her heart began to thaw. Days turned into weeks, and the weeks stretched into a month as the harsh Montana winter held the valley in its unyielding grip. The snow piled high against the log walls of the Double Creek Ranch, insulating the two souls inside from the rest of the world. It was a time of quiet healing, a slow and tender thawing that mirrored the eventual coming of spring. Leanne recovered her strength, not all at once, but in small, victorious increments. First, she could sit up without dizziness. Then she could walk to the window to watch the cardinals flit through the white pine branches. She began to take over the small domestic duties, not out of servitude, as Barnaby had demanded with a raised fist, but out of a genuine desire to bring order and warmth to the home of the man who had saved her. She found Gideon's pantry well stocked but unimaginative, filled with salted pork, beans, and flour. With the addition of dried herbs she found hanging in the cellar, and a delicate touch that Gideon had never possessed, she transformed their meals. The cabin, once smelling only of wood smoke and gun oil, now carried the savory, comforting scents of rosemary, garlic, and slow-roasted venison. Gideon would come in from the freezing cold after tending to the horses, stomping the snow from his boots, and pause at the door, his senses overwhelmed by the change. He watched her moving around his kitchen, her movements graceful and efficient, wearing one of his old flannel shirts that swallowed her small frame until he had ridden into town during a break in the storm to buy her proper fabric. He hadn't known her size, nor her preference, so he had bought bolts of soft blue calico and sturdy wool along with a sewing kit. When he presented them to her, awkwardly shoving the bundle across the table, Leanne had wept. Not from sorrow, but because for the first time in her life in America, someone had thought of her comfort without expecting anything in return. The evenings became their sanctuary. Gideon would mend tack by the fire while Leanne sewed her new dress, the silence between them no longer heavy with fear but rich with a companionable peace. They spoke little, but their eyes met often, shy glances across the flickering firelight. Gideon found himself mesmerizingly drawn to the way the firelight caught the ink-black shine of her hair, and Leanne found her heart beating faster whenever she looked at his broad, capable hands that she now knew could be as gentle as they were strong. It was a soft, unspoken romance, built on the foundation of safety. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Gideon stood to pour them tea. His hand brushed hers as he set the cup down, and neither pulled away. The contact was electric, a spark that traveled straight to the soul. "You have made this house a home, Leanne," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I lived here for 10 years, but I don't think I ever really lived until you got here." Leanne looked up at him, her dark eyes shining. "And you gave me a life, Gideon. I was a ghost before. Now I am real." Then came the spring, arriving with the violent cracking of river ice and the roar of meltwater rushing down from the peaks. The world turned from white to a muddy, vibrant brown and green, the scent of wet earth replacing the crisp bite of frost. But with the melting snow came the opening of the roads, and with the open roads came the return of the outside world and the shadows of the past. Gideon became more vigilant, his eyes scanning the horizon whenever he worked the fields. He wore his Colt revolver on his hip now, a weight that Leanne noticed but did not comment on. She felt the shift in him, the tension coiling in his shoulders. The isolation that had protected them was dissolving. One afternoon, Gideon rode into the settlement of Silver Creek to trade for supplies, leaving Leanne with a heavy heart and a loaded shotgun by the door. When he returned hours later, the sun was dipping below the mountains, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. He did not smile when he dismounted. He walked into the cabin, the dust of the road clinging to his coat, and Leanne knew immediately that the news was bad. "He's alive," Gideon said, not needing to speak the name. He took off his hat, running a hand through his unruly hair. "Barnaby. He's been in the saloon telling anyone who will listen that his property ran off in the storm. He's playing the victim, Leanne. He says you stole from him." Leanne felt the blood drain from her face, her hands gripping the back of a chair for support. The terror she had buried deep down surged back up, cold and suffocating. "He will come," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He thinks he owns me. He paid for my passage. To him, I am like a horse or a plow." Gideon crossed the room in 2 long strides, taking her shoulders in his hands. His grip was firm, grounding her. "Look at me," he commanded, his gray eyes blazing with a fierce intensity. "You are not a horse. You are not a plow. And you sure as hell aren't his property. Not anymore." He lowered his voice, the anger giving way to a desperate protectiveness. "I won't let him take you, Leanne. I would burn this whole ranch to the ground before I let him lay a hand on you again. Do you understand?" Leanne looked into his face, seeing the raw determination there. For the first time, she realized that this man wasn't just offering her shelter. He was offering her a fortress. "I am afraid," she admitted, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "Good," Gideon said, wiping a tear away with his thumb, his touch lingering on her skin. "Fear keeps you sharp. But don't you worry about the fighting. That's my job. You just keep being the brave woman who survived a blizzard. We face him together." The confrontation happened 3 days later, under a sky so blue it seemed to mock the darkness descending upon the ranch. The sound of hooves thundering up the long driveway shattered the morning calm. Gideon was in the barn, but he was out in the yard before the riders even pulled to a halt. It was Barnaby Thorne, flanked by 2 other men, rough drifters he had likely bought with cheap whiskey and lies. Barnaby looked worse than Leanne remembered. His face was bloated from drink, his eyes bloodshot and darting with a mixture of malice and greed. He sat heavily on his horse, sneering down at Gideon. "Well, well," Barnaby spat, his voice grating like gravel. "I heard a rumor the hermit of Double Creek found something of mine." Gideon stood with his feet apart, his hand resting casually near the holistic on his hip, though his posture screamed readiness. "I found a woman half dead in the snow, Thorne," Gideon replied, his voice calm but carrying across the yard like a cracking whip. "I didn't see your name branded on her." Barnaby laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "She's my wife, by law and by God. I paid good money for that shipment. Now send her out, Mercer, and maybe I won't burn your barn down." The threat hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Gideon didn't flinch. "She isn't coming with you. You forfeited your rights when you threw her out to die." Barnaby's face turned a violent shade of red. "She's mine. Leanne, get out here," he roared at the cabin. The door creaked open. Gideon tensed, ready to draw, but he didn't move to stop her. Leanne stepped onto the porch. She was not the tattered, freezing creature Barnaby remembered. She was wearing the blue calico dress, her hair braided intricately, her chin held high. She held the shotgun Gideon had left her, not pointed at them, but held with an ease that suggested she knew how to use it. "I am here, Barnaby," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing out in the yard. Barnaby blinked, taken aback by her appearance and her defiance. "Get on the horse, woman," he snarled, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I have chores for you." Leanne shook her head slowly. "No," she said, "I am not coming. You threw me away. You chose the whiskey. You chose the cold. I choose to stay." Barnaby kicked his stirrups, his hand going for the pistol in his belt. "I'll drag you back if I have to." But before his fingers could even graze the handle, the deafening crack of a gunshot split the air. Gideon's smoking Colt was leveled at Barnaby's chest. He hadn't shot the man, but he had put a bullet through Barnaby's hat, sending it flying into the mud. The horse reared, nearly throwing the drunkard. "The next one won't miss," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Get off my land. If I ever see you near her again, the sheriff won't be the one coming for you. It'll be me." Barnaby stared down the barrel of the gun, then at Leanne's steely gaze. He saw no fear there anymore, only resolve. His hired hands, sensing there was no money worth dying for, turned their horses. Barnaby spat on the ground, his bravado crumbling. "Keep her, then," he sneered, wheeling his horse around. "She never was much use anyway." He rode off, a defeated, small man shrinking against the vast landscape. As the dust settled and the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, the adrenaline that had held Leanne upright suddenly evaporated. Her knees buckled, the shotgun slipping from her grasp. Gideon was there in an instant, catching her before she hit the porch floor. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck. They stayed like that for a long time, the only sound the frantic beating of their two hearts slowing into a synchronized rhythm. "He's gone," Gideon murmured into her hair, breathing in the scent of her, verifying she was still there, still real. "He's gone, Leanne." She pulled back slightly to look at him, her hands trembling as they rested on his chest. "You stood for me," she whispered, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "You faced him." Gideon looked at her, his expression stripping away all his usual stoicism to reveal the raw, tender heart beneath. "I would face an army for you, Leanne. Don't you know that by now?" The realization hung between them, shimmering like the heat haze over the fields. The danger was past. She was free. Legally it might be messy, but out here, on the frontier, the law of the gun and the law of the heart were what mattered. "You are free to go," Gideon said, the words painful for him to speak. "If you want to go to the city, to find your people, I will take you. I won't keep you here against your will." He started to pull away, to give her the choice he felt she deserved, but Leanne's hands tightened on his coat. She didn't let him go. "My people?" she asked softly. She looked around the ranch, the garden she had started to plant, the porch where they watched the sunsets, and finally, the man standing before her. "You are my people, Gideon." She reached up, cupping his rough, bearded cheek with her soft palm. "I do not want to go. My home is here, with you." Gideon closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, a shudder of relief passing through him. When he opened his eyes again, they were filled with a love so profound it took her breath away. He leaned down and their lips met, tentative at first, a question asked and answered, and then deepening into a kiss that tasted of spring rain and promise, a seal on a bond that had been forged in ice and tempered in fire. Years have a way of flowing like the creek that gave the ranch its name, sometimes turbulent, but mostly steady and enduring. The story of the Chinese bride and the reclusive rancher became something of a legend in Silver Creek, whispered about in the general store and told to newcomers as a warning against cruelty and a testament to love. Barnaby Thorne drank himself into an early grave not 2 years after that day, leaving behind nothing but a ruined shack and a cautionary tale. But up at the Double Creek Ranch, life flourished. Gideon and Leanne didn't just survive, they built a legacy. The cabin expanded, room by room, to accommodate a growing family. The laughter of children, dark-haired like their mother, gray-eyed like their father, filled the air that was once silent. Leanne brought her culture to the valley, teaching her children the songs of her ancestors, while Gideon taught them to ride and rope. They planted a massive garden that became the envy of the territory, where peonies grew alongside wildflowers, a symbol of two worlds blending into something beautiful. One evening, many years later, an older Gideon sat on the porch swing, watching the sun dip below the peaks. His hair was white now, his movements slower, but his hand still held Leanne's with the same fierce devotion. She sat beside him, mending a quilt, the same quilt he had wrapped her in that first night. They didn't need to speak. They simply watched the golden light wash over the land they had tamed together. They had weathered the harshest winter of their lives to find an eternal spring. And that, my friends, is where we leave Gideon and Leanne, surrounded by the warmth they fought so hard to protect. It just goes to show that sometimes the worst storms bring us to exactly where we are meant to be. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe for more tales of romance and redemption on the frontier. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright.